We've got a lot to talk about and only a few minutes. Let's dive right into the news. Tomorrow,
Yep.
Mark Zuckerberg is showing up in Washington for his now semi-annual grilling. And he and other CEOs of big tech companies are going to face questions about what they are and are not doing to protect kids online. Francis, you might have inspired a little bit that's going to happen at this session. I hear you're going to be there. I'd like to know two things from you.
Okay.
One, what would you like to hear tomorrow? And two, what do you think you're actually going to hear from these companies?
Oh, interesting. I think one of the things so we don't get very many opportunities to directly ask these CEOs questions. Like if you'll notice, Mark Zuckerberg doesn't talk to media unless it's like a really warm podcast.
Can confirm.
Yeah. But the other CEOs aren't that much better. Like other than maybe the CEO of X, who does go out and do a lot of these media appearances. We don't get to hear them from that often. And so I'm hoping is that the senators will use this opportunity in an election year to show that they have a spine and ask really direct questions around the fact that a lot of these CEOs have actively misled the Senate in the past. We now have not one lawsuit, so it's the 33-state AG lawsuit against Meta. We have 11 more filings from other individual states that sued as well, for a total of 44 states. And that adds up to thousands of pages of documentation of how the company misled the public. So I'm hoping they'll take a little bit step beyond that and actually ask them direct questions about, when you said this, what did you mean? Because you sent many, many, many emails saying something else internally. What I think we'll actually see is, this is where you get ads for election years. And so I'm worried that there'll be a lot of kind of hot take questions, like gotcha questions, and that might get old 5 or 6 hours in. So.
Right. Chair Rosenworcel, what role does the FCC play in protecting kids broadly and specifically kids online?
Yeah, I think this is interesting because I think Francis represents thinking about new media. And in many respects, the Federal Communications Commission is about old media. But I think what is really striking is the story of what we did to protect kids in old media doesn't get told enough. I oversee broadcasting and cable, and I can tell you over the years we have passed laws and put in place policies to address obscenity, to make sure that advertising was limited to kids on their programs, to make sure educational content was available on the television. We did things because the Surgeon General came out and said smoking might be bad for kids. The Marlboro Man, he left the airwaves. We created a V-chip to try to help parents control what content they would allow their kids to see, and a rating system. And not all of these things were perfect. But they reflect something, which is that we had values. We wanted to make sure that the screens around us that were so influential on our kids, there'd be some healthy content there, and that parents could put kids in front of them and feel a little bit okay about what their kids were being exposed to. And if you think about the new media world, those guardrails have largely disappeared. And I think it is important to tell the story about what the Federal Communications Commission did with old media, because it's a reminder that we're capable. We have this muscle, and we shouldn't let it wither, because our kids and what they see and hear is too important to disregard.
Do you think the FCC and your sister agency, the FTC, have sufficient authority right now to protect kids online, or do you think Congress needs to do something else for you?
I think more targeted authority is important. I mean, you're talking about agencies that were created in the 1930s. The language creating them is vague, and I think that, there's some power in that vagueness, but the truth is the digital age has introduced so many new models, so many new types of businesses, and so many new ways we interact with media that an update from Congress is really important. And when we don't get an update from Congress, you know what happens? State legislatures start getting involved. And we have like 36 state legislatures that introduced laws on kids and content. And by the way, they're a real mixed bag, right? But it feels to me that it is not a state-by-state exercise figuring out if kids matter in California and Maine. We should have national policies in place.
Right. And your hands are tied until they do?
Well, I can do a lot, looking at broadcasting and cable and some older technologies, but with the kinds of things that my kids use every day, and I've got 2 teenagers, so believe me, I know not just professionally, but personally, those things are really outside of our reach and our purview.
And Frances, as an activist in this space, what do you think needs to happen structurally in terms of how our government protects kids online?
So one of the things, when you're talking about what is your current remit under the law, one of the questions I'm always asked is like, what are effective laws that allow for innovation, that allow for us to solve our way out of problems, not just catastrophize? And one of the places that I think the FCC has historically played a really vital role is making sure we can have competition. Like the reason we have stations on the radio dial or TV stations is so that we don't interfere with each
Harmful
other.
interference.
Right?
Yes.
I have an electrical engineering degree,
All
so
right.
I think this is very exciting.
It's
Right?
fantastic.
Yeah. But the reason we have those laws is that we actually can have independent actors being out there innovating, playing in the same spaces. When it comes to things like new digital technologies, because these are the intangible economy, not the tangible economy, I can't actually compare products, which means as a consumer or as an advertiser, I can't use my dollars to shape innovation. All I have to go off of is marketing messages. And one of the core things that was in the AG lawsuits was that Meta put out reports saying this is the level of bullying, this is the amount of self-harm content, eating disorder content that's on our platforms, and there was orders of magnitude more of those things. The FCC can actually trigger innovation, trigger a lot of moving forward just by saying, we can do nutrition labels. We can, if we had the authority to say, we need to know what's happening on your systems. You don't have to give us your secret sauce, but you need to let us actually go in there and check to see how much of this harmful content is going to kids? How often is it going to kids? That empowers parents to make real choices and be able to drive that innovation forward.
So big tech is not represented on our stage, so there'll be the imaginary person over here. But their answer to a lot of these questions, and I'm sure we'll hear it tomorrow, is we give people parental controls. So I have a question for the audience. There's a lot of parents out there. How many of you have actually set up parental controls on your kids' social media and other kinds of accounts? Show of hands, show of hands. Okay, so the Washington Post has a story that just published this morning, which found internal documents from Meta that says by the end of 2022, less than 10% of parents had set up parental controls on their kids' accounts. So the question is that enough for these companies to say, we give you tools and controls? It's where they always go. And
Well, there's a difference between making tools available and creating market incentives.
Totally.
Go ahead.
No,
Yeah.
it's sorry. This is one of these things where having an even ruler, like having nutrition, like let's remember when trans fats disappeared from our foods, right? The medical establishment came out and said a very tiny amount of these compounds, if they're in our food, it substantially increases heart disease, risk of strokes, things like that. And the government didn't come out and ban them. They didn't say you can't. We can control what you eat. Like they didn't do that. They said you have to report what's actually in your food. And overnight, Oreos got rid of it. Overnight, Cheetos got rid of it. Like stuff that your kids eat every day. It was safer. Because we don't have any of that fair rulers, we don't get to innovate out of these things.
Yeah, I mean, what we have are companies that have incentives for endless scrolling, enragement, all the things that you may not actually choose if you had the option to choose. But boy, parents are really busy. I mean, I speak from experience with that. We're really busy. And 5 clicks in to figure out how to do something, to read all those terms of service, to tick off a box where I might be giving up rights, I'm not sure what they are. Like, that's
like
not actually
LSAT
a choice.
trying to understand some of these questions sometimes. If
Yeah.
I check this, then I don't agree.
But I want us to start from the proposition that that's more complicated for most parents than it is beneficial. And what is beneficial for all of us is that we build laws and market structures that put incentives in place for companies to care about the well-being of youth in this country.
Because to quote the other Facebook whistleblower, so Arturo Bejar was going to be here today, but unfortunately is in DC prepping for the CSAM hearing tomorrow. He said, as long as Facebook has to report their profit and loss numbers, their expenses, but doesn't have to report how many kids are contacted with a sexual communication they don't want, that number's not going to go down.
So the EU and the United Kingdom have been a lot more aggressive than the US in making regulations.
Assertive,
okay, assertive. And making regulations, both about things like online privacy, but then also kids. What, if anything, can the United States learn from them? What should we take? What should we skip? Either of you?
Yeah.
Well, it's early days in the Digital Services Act. But I think what strikes me most as someone who sits in Washington is that the center of our government has pressures from the states to act on these issues and pressures from Europe to act on these issues, because most are far more active at passing legislation than our Congress. And often when I talk about these issues and I get pushback from members of Congress, I'll be like, okay, cool. You like Sacramento making the rules for the country? You're all in. Do you like them in Brussels making all these choices for US companies? All right, we'll live with that. And I think it's important to realize that it's not just that we are not passing legislation on these issues. We are accepting frameworks from a lot of other political actors. And I think the future of kids is just too important. We should be having national policies for these things.
And I think one of the things to keep in mind, too, is these platforms have shown over and over again that they act not necessarily to optimize for safety, but they do for optimizing expenses versus potentially risk, like risk of getting sued, risk of advertisers boycotting, all those things. And that means that if Australia can ask for detailed data on safety of kids, or the UK can, they passed a big online safety bill just last October, or Europe can, all those places are going to get more sunlight. They're going to know what's going on, and they're going to allocate more safety resources to them. So if we don't act, if we don't have similar amounts of mandated transparency, we should expect our kids to not get as safe experiences as people in Europe, Australia, or Canada.
So Frances, I know you like transparency. That's where you often begin with the pressures on these companies to act better. Is there anything else you like about the UK safety bill or other things you've seen in other markets that you think we should bring here? And also things you don't like. I mean, there's a lot of ideas out there about everything from checking kids' ages to giving parents power over over their kids' apps.
So what I do like about the Online Safety Bill and the Digital Services Act is they try to build in incentives for safety by design. If you sit there and say, hey, we are going to ask to look at your risk assessment. We want to see that you thought through, how could this go wrong? How might this go wrong? How might we deal with these things? If you put in place the incentives to say, you can't think about safety after the fact or after some scandal happens, I think that's really, really positive. I get very, like you said, there's some state bills where I get a little nervous. I think children have the right to privacy online. That doesn't mean parents don't have the right to data about what their kids are doing online. But I don't think it's constructive for you to be able to ride along right over your child's shoulder. So that could mean things like maybe you do get a warning that your kid is looking at more self-harm content or more eating disorder content, but you shouldn't be able to see your kid's feed. And that's what's in some of the state laws.
This tension you brought up, though, about privacy keeps coming up in conversations about kids.
Yeah.
So, a lot of tech activists and advocates say we need encryption, which protects us from being spied on by governments and by corporations. But then advocates who want to stop child sexual abuse material say, no, we shouldn't have encryption because you got to go in there and see who's making the stuff and when they're sharing it. How do we solve those?
So this is one of these issues that drives me a little nuts because the sound bites are really clean. It's like, are you for freedom of speech? Are you for safety? Clearly there's only a binary option. And the reality is when it comes to things like end-to-end encrypted apps, right? I think we're going to move into a world where more and more will happen on our devices. Right, you might belong to a social network in 10 years where there is no central server. It's just going between nodes on the periphery. But that doesn't mean that you can't still act for safety. One of the things that I keep pushing tech companies on is the way laws work is at some point the aggregate amount of harm becomes so much it becomes unacceptable. And the question is, do you do practical, small interventions, modern interventions now, or do you wait for emotional, extreme interventions later? In the case of end-to-end encryption, we can have apps that ride along on device and say, hey, we've noticed you send some awfully questionable content. We're just not going to let you send attachments anymore. Right, like that's not saying we're going to report you to the police. It's not saying we're going to send all your files. But it's one of these things where saying, can we have compromises where we say we need 99% less CSAM in the world? Like we should be having those conversations, and people are refusing to say, is there anything that's in the middle?
Middle ground, often not
Yeah.
not a popular topic in Washington. We are almost out of time, but I want to ask each of you to sort of help me imagine a better future for kids, and we'll start with you, Chair. So looking 5 to 10 years into the future, what does a healthier environment for kids online look like? What's in place for them? What's in place for their parents, so that we don't have to keep relying on people like Francis and Arturo to come from inside these companies and say, do you know what's going on here?
Yeah, I think actually that's the point. First, we need a lot more data. It is astonishing to me how little we know about what our algorithms deliver to us and to our children. And we've relied on whistleblowers to try to figure some of this out, but we don't have enough information. I mean, I think about the Consumer Product Safety Commission a lot. And if you build a toy and it has lead in it, they're not going to let you do something with it. If you build a toy that's problematic because children will swallow parts and get harmed, they're not going to let you put it on the marketplace. I think about old media and the FCC. We had programs and channels, and there were actors who rated them, including Common Sense Media, so parents would know things. That world where we had information and we could be consumers is really not one that we live in right now with social media. And I really think there's legislation, I think Senator Coons has sponsored it, on Platform Accountability and Data Transparency Act, that is really, really important for us to understand fundamental safety issues about life online. And at the risk of it getting too wonkish, in the president's recent executive order on AI, I think you see a very clear understanding that that mistake was made in Web 2.0, but we won't make it in Web 3.0. You have the Commerce Department using the Defense Production Act to understand safety with AI models, because it's a recognition that without that data, we can't put in place the right incentives for our kids and for our parents. So that's more about a starting point than an ending point, but I think it's really important to reiterate that we have been in this social media era without that kind of data and information.
Francis, 10 years from now, what's in place to make the internet a healthier place for kids?
I have like a very radical position on this, which is I look at things like, I know we don't use the phrase the metaverse anymore, like that moved out of fashion, but VR is going to keep getting more and more compelling.
Vision Pro is coming Friday.
Vision Pro. It's supposed to be amazing, but the challenge. My vision for children on the internet in the future, and this is particularly say kids under the age of 13, is I hope in 10 years we don't have a lot of kids under the age of 13 on the internet, because one of the things that really scares me is when you put on the Oculus and you go walk around Horizon's world, you tell me how many adults you talk to, because almost every person you talk to is under the age of 12. And the thing that I fear is that having in-person places where children can play or connect or learn social skills are expensive, and digital places are really cheap. And so my hope is that we keep building out choices for families so that people have meaningful ability to say, I want to wait for 8 for my kid. And that means not just social media, it means things like VR as well.
I'm afraid we are out of time, but I want to thank our two guests for their work and this conversation.
Thank you.